I was just a shy intern. That was all I was. The kind of person who blended into the background so seamlessly that, in a room full of people, you could forget I existed entirely. My days at Meridian Communications were predictable, quiet, and often lonely. I carried a notebook everywhere, scribbling little reminders to myself, practicing smiles in the reflection of office glass doors before stepping into the buzz of the corporate lobby. It was my armor, my way of convincing the world that I belonged even if I didn't entirely believe it myself. 6 months ago, I had walked into Meridian full of naive optimism, fresh from college with my communications degree clutched in hand and dreams bigger than I knew how to articulate. I imagined myself contributing to campaigns, learning from creative minds, and slowly carving out a place in the professional world. But reality had a different plan. I was the intern who made copies, fetched coffee, organized supply closets, and otherwise became invisible. Not intentionally invisible, though some days I wished I were, but invisible nonetheless, a shadow among people who seemed to glide effortlessly through the corporate hierarchy. That I had a routine. I arrived early, stayed late, and never spoke up in meetings. Not once. I ate lunch at my desk, avoiding the common areas where conversations flowed freely. Small talk terrified me. And worse, I feared exposing the fragility that had been reinforced by college failures and rejections. Over the years, the confident, outgoing girl I had been in high school had gradually eroded into someone careful, observant, and mostly quiet. My only anchor, the only place where my confidence felt natural, was at home with my little brother, Danny. He was 8, born deaf, and teaching me more about patience, communication, and empathy than any lecture or textbook ever could. It was Danny who had inspired me to learn American Sign Language. I threw myself into it with the kind of passion that surprised even me. Hours of practice, videos, community classes. I absorbed everything I could. When people questioned why I dedicated so much energy to learning something useless for my career, I shrugged. I was doing it for him, for the moments when I could bridge a gap that otherwise left him invisible. That skill, which seemed irrelevant in college and entirely unnecessary at Meridian, would soon prove to be the most valuable skill I had. That Tuesday morning was like any other at Meridian. The lobby buzzing with hurried footsteps, the sharp clatter of heels on polished floors, the low hum of conversations and phones. We were in the middle of preparing for a major client presentation, so stress levels were high. Everyone was focused on their tasks, their faces locked in determination or tension. I was stationed at the reception area, organizing materials, refilling brochures, and quietly observing the controlled chaos of corporate life. And then I noticed him. An elderly man, impeccably dressed in a navy suit that looked expensive and perfectly tailored, standing near the reception desk. Silver hair combed neatly, posture straight but with a subtle weariness in his shoulders. He looked entirely out of place in the whirlwind of corporate activity. The first thing I noticed was his eyes. A mixture of frustration and gentle hope, scanning the room, searching for someone who might understand him. I watched him try to communicate with Jessica, our head receptionist. She was polite but clearly overwhelmed, rushing from one inquiry to another. "Sir, I'm sorry, but I don't understand. Do you have an appointment? Can you write down who you're here to see?" she asked, her tone patient but hurried. The man gestured, mouth moving slightly, pointing toward the elevators and then back at the desk. The subtle movements of his fingers, the expressions on his face, everything clicked in an instant. He was signing. I froze for a moment, unsure if I should intervene. My mind screamed, "I'm just an intern. This isn't my responsibility. Don't get involved." But my heart refused to listen. I thought about Danny. I thought about the countless times people had ignored him, looked right through him as though his deafness erased his existence. I couldn't let that happen again, not to anyone. So I stepped forward. My hands trembled slightly, but I signed carefully. "Hello. My name is Kathryn. Can I help you?" The transformation was immediate. His eyes widened, the stress in his posture evaporated, replaced by surprise, relief, and finally a radiant smile. He responded smoothly, signing with the fluidity of someone who had been using ASL all his life. I repeated my signs slowly, unsure if I was remembering everything correctly, but he corrected me patiently, smiling as we communicated. For the first time that day, the lobby seemed to fade away. Just the two of us. Bridging a gap that the rest of the world had ignored, he told me he was trying to see his son. No appointment. Uncertain about directions. Hesitant, polite, wary of imposing. I listened, nodded, and reassured him that I would help. And all the while, I noticed how the other employees walked past, distracted or disinterested, as though the universe itself was conspiring to make this distinguished-looking man invisible. But I didn't see it that way. I saw someone who mattered. Someone deserving of attention and dignity. That we moved toward a seating area in the lobby, arranging chairs so he could see me clearly. As we settled, I realized I had no idea how to actually arrange a meeting with the CEO, the very person he wanted to see. My pulse quickened. But instead of panic, I felt determination. I would find a way. I picked up the phone and called Patricia, the CEO's executive assistant, bracing myself for the impossible. The conversation was delicate. "Mr. Hartwell's father is here," I explained, trying to sound calm. "He would like to see him if possible." There was a pause, longer than I expected. Then, "I'll need to check with Mr. Hartwell. Can you have the visitor wait?" Of course. I thanked her and returned to our makeshift corner of quiet, where conversation flowed in hand movements and expressions that we talked about his life. Robert Hartwell, he introduced himself, his career as an architect, his late wife who had been a teacher at the Illinois School for the Deaf, the challenges of raising a hearing son as a deaf parent. I learned about his pride, his hopes, and his subtle disappointments, conveyed entirely through the grace of his hands and the stories behind his eyes. And as I listened, translating occasional questions from employees or helping him navigate the lobby, I began to realize how little of the world recognized the value of someone like him. How often kindness, empathy, and patience went unseen in places like this. Time passed. Minutes stretched into half an hour. I could see the disappointment creeping across his face when Patricia called back. Michael was tied up in meetings. "Perhaps I should come back another time," he signed softly. "I don't want to be a bother." "You are not a bother," I signed back, and in that moment I meant it. I could see the corners of his eyes soften. A small smile reappeared. And then, almost instinctively, I offered a compromise. "Would you like to wait a little longer? I can show you around. There's beautiful artwork upstairs, and you could see where your son works." He hesitated, then nodded, his excitement tangible. And that's how the most unauthorized tour in Meridian Communications history began. Over the next 2 hours, I abandoned my duties, copying, organizing, preparing presentation materials, all for him. I showed him the creative department, the account management teams, the small nooks where employees brainstormed ideas. I translated conversations, explained processes, shared insight about campaigns, and watched his face light up with pride as he saw the world his son had built. And then I noticed him. Michael Hartwell, CEO of the company, standing on the mezzanine, partially hidden behind a pillar, watching us, watching me. My heart skipped. I froze momentarily, realizing the potential consequences of my actions. An unauthorized tour, neglecting my work, breaking every protocol in place. But then, just as suddenly, he stepped back into shadow, leaving me to continue with the visitor as though he had never been there. I didn't know it then, but that silent observation would change everything. The choice I made in those moments, driven by empathy and a refusal to let someone be overlooked, would ripple outward in ways I could never imagine. As we returned to the lobby, the day fading into afternoon, I felt a sense of fulfillment I hadn't known in months. He had seen the world his son created. He had been treated with respect and dignity. And in doing so, I felt a small yet profound shift in myself. Courage, compassion, and a willingness to act. That was the power of noticing someone who had been invisible. That day, I realized something crucial. Life isn't about following instructions blindly or hiding in the corners. Life is about choosing, in each small moment, to be the person who sees, who acknowledges, who bridges the gaps others ignore. And sometimes those small choices echo louder than any presentation, any deadline, any task ever could. I never imagined that a single hello signed in the middle of a bustling lobby could be the beginning of the day that would change everything about my career, my confidence, and my sense of purpose. But it was. And I had no idea that someone very important had been watching all along. The elevator doors closed behind us. the soft hum of machinery filling the small space, and I could feel the adrenaline from the morning slowly settling in my chest. Robert, Michael's father, sat opposite me, his hands folded neatly in his lap, a quiet dignity emanating from him even in this small, confined space. There was an air of anticipation in the elevator that was almost tangible, as though every breath we drew carried the weight of unspoken words, the gravity of experiences that had been long overlooked, and the uncharted potential of what was to come. As we ascended the floors, I watched Robert's eyes roam over the interior panels of the elevator, taking in the subtle details of the polished metal, the soft lighting, the faint reflections in the mirrored walls. He seemed contemplative, perhaps recalling memories of buildings he had designed, spaces he had shaped, or simply marveling at the quiet, precise rhythm of modern corporate life that contrasted so starkly with the chaos of his own experiences raising a hearing child while navigating a world that wasn't always accommodating to the deaf. I wanted to break the silence, to fill the elevator with some semblance of normal conversation, but the words felt inadequate. How could I explain what I was feeling? How could I articulate the immense gratitude I felt for the opportunity to connect with someone whose life, like Danny's, was shaped by being overlooked, dismissed, or misunderstood? I found myself adjusting the strap of my bag, glancing at Robert, and then letting my hands rest in my lap. The silence became comfortable, almost sacred, a shared understanding between us that transcended words. When the doors opened on the executive floor, Robert's eyes widened slightly, taking in the sleek modern furnishings, the panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, and the subtle displays of Meridian Communications' achievements in the form of awards, framed photographs, and tastefully curated artwork. He moved slowly, deliberately, as though each step was an exploration, a way to absorb the world his son had created. "This is Michael's domain," I signed gently, careful to keep my gestures smooth and clear. "The space is where he makes decisions, meets clients, and leads the company." Robert nodded, his expression a mixture of awe and pride. He ran his fingers lightly over the back of a leather chair, as if to anchor himself in the reality of the moment. And I realized that this was more than a building tour for him. It was a bridge between worlds, the personal and professional, the deaf and hearing, the familiar and the unfamiliar. As we moved through the floor, I noticed subtle changes in Robert's demeanor. The initial wariness had softened into curiosity, and now, as he interacted with employees, asking questions and responding with insightful observations, there was a joy in his movements, a vibrancy in his gestures that had been missing when he first entered the lobby. I translated his comments, guided him through conversations with team members, and watched as employees began to notice the genuine engagement taking place. Some were polite, offering brief nods or smiles, but a few paused, intrigued by the presence of a man whose life experiences clearly held depth and wisdom far beyond their immediate tasks. I could feel the tension in my chest begin to shift. What had started as nervous hesitation, the fear of stepping beyond my intern role, the anxiety of breaking protocol, was giving way to a profound sense of purpose. Every smile, every shared story, every subtle acknowledgement of understanding reinforced the notion that this was where I was meant to be, exactly in that moment, doing exactly what I was doing. Then I noticed him again. Michael, the CEO, standing partially concealed behind a structural pillar, observing us. His posture was relaxed yet commanding, the kind of presence that made the air feel heavier simply because he occupied it. I tried to focus on Robert and the tour, on the stories being exchanged and the shared laughter that occasionally escaped our hands and faces. But the knowledge that Michael was watching added a layer of intensity one hadn't anticipated. Every gesture felt amplified, every word and sign weighed with the potential consequences of discovery. And yet, there was something about his gaze that didn't feel accusatory. It wasn't judgmental. It was deliberate, measured, almost curious. He wasn't just watching me. He was observing the interaction, the connection, the way empathy had bridged a gap that procedure and hierarchy often ignored. It was a quiet acknowledgement that something meaningful was unfolding, even if it wasn't happening according to the rules. We moved to the marketing analytics department next, a space buzzing with computers, charts, and the hum of digital activity. Robert's attention was captivated by the strategy boards and analytics dashboards. He leaned slightly over one of the monitors, his eyes scanning the intricate data visualizations, occasionally signing questions about metrics or audience engagement. I translated carefully, doing my best to convey not just the words but the intent behind the technical jargon. "You've built an empire here," I signed to him, as he watched the team explain their workflow. "Your son has created something remarkable." Robert's hands paused mid-sign, his eyes softening. "It is remarkable," he replied, the weight of decades of experience and pride evident in the fluidity of his gestures. "But it is more than that. It is a reflection of who he is, the values he embodies, the determination that shaped him from childhood." There was a pause then, a quiet moment in which the hum of activity in the department seemed to fade away, leaving only the shared space between us. I realized that the impact of this day was rippling outward, beyond the walls of this office, touching something deeper in both of us. The work we were doing wasn't simply administrative or logistical. It was transformative. As we navigated the hallways, introducing Robert to various employees and translating conversations, I noticed small acts of humanity that often went unnoticed in the rush of corporate life. A junior associate paused to greet him with genuine warmth. A designer, previously buried in sketches and layouts, took a moment to explain a concept that had clearly fascinated him. And each time, I felt a growing sense of responsibility, not just to Robert, but to the culture of Meridian itself. This was the kind of inclusion and empathy I had always hoped to see in the professional world. And here I was, facilitating it in real time. By the time we reached the break room, Robert was smiling openly, a brightness in his eyes that hadn't been there when he arrived. He shared stories of his own youth, of coffee shops he had frequented, of conversations with clients and colleagues who had shaped his career. Employees lingered for a moment, captivated by the narrative, and I translated every word with care, ensuring that the essence of his experience was conveyed, not just the surface-level communication. And then it happened. Michael reappeared, moving from the mezzanine toward the edge where he could observe more directly. This time, I caught the shift in his posture, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the way his hands rested lightly on the railing as if anchoring himself to the moment. He was studying us, absorbing the dynamic between intern and visitor, between father and son. I couldn't tell what he was thinking, but I felt the weight of it, the silent power of his presence. I glanced back at Robert, who seemed blissfully unaware of the CEO's observation. His focus was entirely on understanding this environment, on connecting with the people who made his son's world tangible. And I, too, was absorbed in the rhythm of communication, the delicate translation of words and emotions, the weaving of understanding across gaps that otherwise might have remained unbridged. Time became elastic. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and yet the flow never faltered. Every interaction carried significance. Every gesture, every smile, every sign was a thread weaving a tapestry of connection, empathy, and inclusion. And through it all, I became acutely aware of my own transformation. The shy, invisible intern who had once feared making mistakes was now the conduit for something far greater. Understanding, respect, and human dignity in a space that often overlooked both. When we finally approached the executive office, Robert paused, his gaze sweeping over the polished wood paneling, the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the subtle elegance of the furnishings. "Michael has built all of this," he signed almost reverently. "He has created a world that many will never see, and yet it reflects him entirely." I nodded, feeling the truth in his words. "Yes," I signed back. "And today you are seeing it in your own way. You are part of it, even if only for a moment." He looked at me then, a quiet gratitude in his eyes, the weight of his experiences reflected in the depth of his gaze. "Thank you," he signed simply. And in that moment, I realized that the simplest gestures, a hello, a smile, a willingness to connect, could carry the power to transform not just one life, but an entire world. And somewhere just out of sight, Michael Hartwell continued to watch. His presence was subtle, almost ghost-like, yet undeniably significant. The choices I was making, the attention I was giving, the empathy I was extending, all of it was being noted, silently, carefully, and without judgment. And I knew, even if I didn't fully understand it yet, that this day was only the beginning. The moment felt suspended in time. We had reached the executive floor, Robert standing at the edge of the space, awed by the sheer scale of the office and the weight of the legacy his son had built, and I, Kathryn, feeling a mixture of exhilaration and dread. My stomach churned with the realization that the CEO of the company, Michael Hartwell, had been observing everything. For an intern, that was terrifying. For me, it was almost paralyzing that we lingered for a moment, Robert taking in the panoramic view of Chicago's skyline, his eyes tracing the horizon as if he could see the years of his son's work unfolding like a living blueprint. I translated his signs to the few employees who had gathered, explaining Robert's comments, watching the genuine curiosity and respect appear on the staff's faces. It was a delicate dance of communication, empathy, and attention, and I was entirely immersed in it. Then I noticed him fully. Michael Hartwell stepped out from behind the railing on the mezzanine. He moved with a measured grace, commanding attention without demanding it. His presence immediately shifted the energy in the room. Conversations faltered. Laptops closed. Eyes turned subtly toward the figure of the CEO as he descended the short flight of stairs to where Robert and I were standing. My pulse quickened that I had been so focused on Robert, on guiding him through the spaces and translating his words, that I had not considered how my actions might be perceived. I imagined the lecture from Margaret, my supervisor, the words of reprimand that would surely follow for abandoning my assigned tasks. I could feel the weight of potential consequences pressing down on me. Yet, as Michael approached, there was no anger in his expression. There was a kind of contemplative intensity, a quiet assessment, as though he were weighing not just what had been done but why. "Miss Walsh," he began, his voice calm, but carrying a presence that made it clear this was a moment of gravity. "I need to speak with you." I swallowed hard, nodding. "Of course, sir," I signed, trying to keep my hands steady, my gestures fluid. Robert looked at me with a mixture of surprise and encouragement, sensing the importance of the interaction even if he didn't fully understand the details of the corporate hierarchy at play. Michael gestured for Robert to remain seated, a subtle but deliberate decision that shifted the dynamics. This wasn't just a casual conversation. It was a meeting that carried meaning beyond words, beyond protocol. As we moved a few steps to the side, I felt the nervous energy building. The air was thick with anticipation, a charged quiet that seemed to amplify every heartbeat, every breath. "Kathryn," Michael began again, his eyes locking on mine with a directness that left no room for doubt. "What you've done today is extraordinary. I've been watching, and I need to understand how you knew exactly what to do." I hesitated, struggling to find the right words. It felt surreal that the CEO of the company, a man whose reputation and authority were legendary, was speaking to me directly. "I have a younger brother," I signed, my hands moving carefully, conveying not just the words but the emotional truth behind them. "He's deaf. And I know how it feels when people ignore him, when they act as though he isn't there. I couldn't let that happen to your father." Michael's eyes softened, the tension in his jaw easing slightly. He nodded, acknowledging the weight of what I had just conveyed. Then he did something I hadn't anticipated. He signed. His movements were deliberate but initially awkward, betraying that he was still learning, still finding the rhythm. "I've been trying," he signed, "to communicate better, to bridge gaps. But I haven't succeeded. Not until today." Robert's eyes widened in surprise and delight. I could see the emotion rippling across his face. Here was his son, the man who had been so distant, making a genuine effort to connect. His hands moved rapidly now, conveying gratitude, disbelief, and affection all at once. Michael's gestures followed, slower, careful, but increasingly confident. There was a visible, palpable transformation happening in front of me, a connection long overdue finally being realized. For a few minutes, I simply watched, translating as necessary, yet mostly absorbing the moment myself. The CEO and his father, once separated by years of circumstance and misunderstanding, were finally communicating. And the power of that connection was profound, more than any corporate achievement or project could ever be. Then Michael turned back to me, his expression serious yet filled with something approaching admiration. "Kathryn, you've done something today that I wish more of my employees would even attempt. You've recognized the humanity in my father when most others would have dismissed him. You've created understanding, respect, and inclusion without being asked, without protocol, without instruction." My stomach dropped. I had expected chastisement, perhaps a warning. The idea of a commendation, let alone this kind of acknowledgement, was beyond my wildest imaginings. Sir, I signed tentatively. I was just doing what felt right. I didn't think about anything else. Michael shook his head slightly, a small smile breaking through his otherwise controlled demeanor. No, he signed firmly. This is exactly what needed to happen. And it shows me what has been missing here. Inclusion, empathy, the willingness to see people as people, not obstacles or inconveniences. He paused, and in that pause, I felt the full weight of the moment pressing down on me. This was more than recognition. This was an awakening of sorts, a glimpse into a reality where actions mattered more than hierarchy, where humanity mattered more than efficiency. I need to talk to you about your future here, Michael continued, his eyes meeting mine with a directness that was both intimidating and electrifying. What you've demonstrated today is rare, and I want to ensure that it doesn't go unnoticed or unutilized. My heart skipped a beat. Sir, I signed cautiously. I understand if you feel I should be held accountable. I know I left my assigned tasks incomplete, and he raised a hand, stopping me gently but decisively. No, Kathryn. What you did today was exactly what this company needs. And it has made me realize that we need someone like you, someone with empathy, insight, and courage to help us implement real, meaningful inclusion. Robert's eyes glimmered with pride, a radiant mixture of validation and joy. He signed rapidly, communicating his delight and approval to Michael, who responded in kind. The scene was surreal, the father's gratitude, the son's recognition, and my own astonishment all intertwined in a moment of clarity that left me breathless. Michael leaned slightly forward, his hands moving with increasing confidence now. Kathryn, I'm creating a new position, he signed. Director of Accessibility and Inclusion. You would report directly to me. Your role would be to ensure that everyone who enters this company, employees, clients, visitors, is treated with dignity and respect. You would have the authority to implement policies, develop training, and drive cultural change. I blinked rapidly, struggling to process what I had just heard. Sir, I signed shakily. I'm just an intern. I haven't even finished my degree. I don't have experience with policy or human resources. Michael smiled gently, shaking his head. Experience is valuable, yes. But what you have that others lack is far more important. Empathy, insight, the ability to see people as individuals, to recognize their worth. That is the skill that will transform this company. I looked at Robert, who was practically vibrating with excitement, his hands moving rapidly as he communicated his astonishment. Michael responded, nodding and signing back. And I realized, in a moment that felt both surreal and profoundly real, that my life was about to change. The shy, invisible intern, the girl who had spent so long avoiding attention, had just been offered the opportunity to lead meaningful transformation at one of the most prestigious firms in the city. Michael continued, outlining the position in detail. The salary, the benefits, the scope of authority, and the expectation that I would drive real cultural change. My mind swirled with possibilities, challenges, and the enormity of what was being asked of me. And yet, underneath it all, there was a deep, grounding sense of purpose. This was work that mattered. Work that aligned with who I was and what I had always valued. When the meeting concluded, Robert signed his thanks over and over, his gratitude pouring forth in waves that left me speechless. Michael walked us to the elevator, a subtle but significant acknowledgement of the respect he held for both his father and me, and as the doors closed, he signed one final phrase to me. Thank you for seeing him. Thank you for seeing what matters. I left the building that day in a haze of exhilaration, disbelief, and hope. I called my parents, then Danny, explaining as best I could what had occurred. Danny's eyes lit up on the video call, his excitement infectious. You're going to help people like me? He signed eagerly. You're like a superhero. And in that moment, I realized something profound. The world doesn't need superheroes in capes. It needs people willing to notice, to act, to bridge gaps, and to see the humanity in those who are overlooked. Today, I had done that. Tomorrow, I would continue. And the future, for the first time in a long time, felt wide open. The first day in my new role felt surreal. I walked through the revolving doors of Meridian Communications not as a shy, invisible intern, but as the newly appointed Director of Accessibility and Inclusion. My heart pounded with excitement, nerves, and a weighty sense of responsibility. Everywhere I looked, the office hummed with the familiar energy of professionals deeply immersed in their work. Account managers juggling client calls, creative teams sketching campaigns on whiteboards, and the buzz of printers and computers filling the air. But this time, I wasn't just observing. I was here to make changes, to ensure that every corner of this company reflected respect, inclusivity, and empathy. I knew the work would be challenging. After all, shifting a corporate culture as entrenched and high pressure as Meridian's wouldn't happen overnight. Yet I also felt ready. I had ASL skills, empathy, and a deep understanding of the experiences of people often overlooked in professional spaces. Today, I would start implementing that knowledge. My first task was to conduct a comprehensive accessibility audit of the entire building and all company policies. I had brought a notebook, a pen, and a determination to leave no stone unturned. My plan was to observe, listen, and ask questions. I would examine not just physical accessibility, but also the ways in which communication, workflows, and corporate culture could be improved for everyone, employees, clients, and visitors alike. I started at the lobby, the very place where it all began. I walked past the reception area, now thoughtfully arranged with clear signage, accessible seating, and visual cues for important announcements. I observed the lighting, the ease of navigation, the clarity of the directories. Then I moved to the elevators, noticing the lack of audio cues and realizing how challenging it must have been for a visually impaired visitor to navigate without assistance. I made notes to propose additional braille panels and tactile floor indicators. Next, I visited the conference rooms and meeting spaces. These areas were central to Meridian's operations, yet I quickly realized they were designed primarily for hearing employees. There were no microphones, no captioning, and no visual alert systems. Presentations relied heavily on spoken words, often neglecting employees who might have hearing impairments. I made careful notes, imagining the kinds of solutions that could be implemented. Real-time captioning, portable microphones, training for presenters on clear communication, and visual indicators for meeting cues. I moved from floor to floor, observing how employees navigated shared spaces. The break room, previously a chaotic space with no consideration for inclusivity, now became an area I evaluated for accessibility. I examined seating arrangements, counter heights, signage, and even coffee machine usability. It was a meticulous process, requiring both attention to detail and empathy. Every small oversight could impact someone's sense of belonging, and I wanted to ensure that no one felt invisible. By mid-morning, I began interviewing employees. I approached them with care, explaining my role and encouraging honest feedback. Some were skeptical. After all, I was the youngest director in the company's history, and many wondered whether I had the experience to drive meaningful change. Others were curious, eager to share insights they had previously withheld. Margaret, my former supervisor, approached cautiously, her arms crossed at first. "Kathryn," she said, her voice measured. "I don't mean to be difficult, but you're young. Are you sure this is the right move?" I smiled, nodding gently. "Margaret, this isn't about age. It's about empathy, awareness, and action. I know this company has the potential to be truly inclusive. My goal is to make sure everyone feels valued and respected here, including you." Her expression softened. "I want to help," she admitted, lowering her arms. "I just didn't realize how much of a difference small changes could make." That was the first of many eye-opening conversations. Employees shared stories about missed accommodations, overlooked needs, and moments where they felt unheard. I listened, took notes, and promised to act. For some, it was the first time they felt that their experiences mattered. After lunch, I moved to the HR department, diving into company policies. I reviewed hiring practices, onboarding procedures, training modules, and workplace guidelines. Many policies were well-intentioned but lacked substance. They mentioned diversity and inclusion, but there were no concrete steps, no accountability, and no real measurement of impact. I highlighted gaps, drafted potential amendments, and began outlining a comprehensive accessibility strategy. Next, I turned to digital accessibility. The company website, intranet, and client-facing platforms were visually appealing, but largely inaccessible to people with visual impairments or hearing challenges. Images lacked alt text, videos had no captions, and navigation was cumbersome for those using screen readers. I drafted proposals for accessibility improvements, emphasizing that these changes would not only benefit clients and employees with disabilities, but would enhance the company's reputation and broaden its reach. By late afternoon, I was exhausted but exhilarated. I had walked every floor, spoken to dozens of employees, and documented a comprehensive list of improvements. But I knew that auditing was only the first step. The real challenge lay in implementing change, ensuring adoption, and shifting the corporate mindset. Culture couldn't be altered through policies alone. It required sustained engagement, training, and leadership support. And speaking of leadership, I had my first one-on-one meeting with Michael Hartwell to discuss my findings. He was in his office reviewing documents, his demeanor calm but attentive. I presented my audit results, outlining immediate priorities and long-term strategies. Michael listened intently, occasionally asking questions, occasionally pausing to sign phrases that clarified his thoughts. His engagement and commitment to the process were reassuring. Unlike many CEOs who might delegate responsibility without involvement, Michael was invested in real, meaningful change. "You've clearly put a lot of thought into this," he signed, his eyes meeting mine with intensity. "I want you to take the lead on all initiatives, Kathryn. Not just for the deaf community, but for anyone who might feel overlooked or marginalized. Make this company a model for inclusion." I nodded, signing my agreement, feeling a mixture of pride and responsibility. "Thank you, sir. I'll start by implementing the most urgent changes immediately. Visual alert systems, caption meetings, accessible signage, and employee training are my top priorities." Michael smiled. "Good. And remember, this isn't a one-time effort. Inclusion is ongoing. It requires persistence, adaptability, and patience. You'll face resistance, but I trust your judgment. Your actions today showed me exactly what you're capable of." With his encouragement, I dove into action. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning, meetings, and implementation. I collaborated with building management to install visual alert systems and accessible signage. I coordinated with IT to implement captioning software for all company meetings and client calls. I organized ASL classes during lunch hours, which surprisingly filled up quickly, even attracting employees who initially claimed they had no interest in learning sign language. Margaret became one of my most enthusiastic allies. She attended every training session, shared insights from her experience, and began modeling inclusive behavior herself. Employees who were once skeptical started to see the tangible impact of these initiatives. Conversations became more thoughtful. Meetings included everyone. Visitors with disabilities reported feeling welcomed and respected. The culture was slowly shifting, and the ripple effect was palpable. Throughout all of this, Robert Hartwell remained a source of inspiration. He visited regularly, sharing stories about his experiences as a deaf professional and the challenges he faced navigating a hearing world. His insights were invaluable, and his presence reminded me daily of why this work mattered. He and Michael also began meeting more frequently, their relationship deepening in ways I had only witnessed but never imagined possible. By the end of the first month, I had drafted a formal accessibility policy, created a roadmap for implementation, and launched employee training sessions. The momentum was building, and employees began embracing the changes with enthusiasm rather than obligation. It was no longer just about compliance. It was about creating a culture where everyone felt seen, heard, and valued. But the challenges were not gone. Resistance emerged in subtle ways. Employees who resisted change, questioned priorities, or dismissed the significance of accessibility initiatives. I learned quickly that leading cultural transformation required patience, diplomacy, and unwavering commitment. Every pushback became an opportunity to educate, engage, and reinforce the value of inclusion. One afternoon, I held a workshop for the creative team, focusing on accessible design principles. The room was filled with designers who initially seemed skeptical, accustomed to working in their own bubble of aesthetic priorities. I demonstrated how minor adjustments, like adding alt text to images, using high-contrast color palettes, and ensuring readable fonts, could make a significant difference for visually impaired users. As we worked through examples, something remarkable happened. The designers began experimenting with their work, asking questions, and offering solutions I hadn't anticipated. They were seeing the impact of accessibility not as a limitation, but as a design challenge that could enhance their creativity. It was a small victory, but it symbolized the shift happening within Meridian. In parallel, I began working with HR to redesign hiring and onboarding practices. We implemented standardized accessibility accommodations for interviews, ensured job postings were inclusive, and provided resources for candidates with disabilities. We also developed mentorship programs to support employees from underrepresented groups, fostering an environment of growth and inclusion. Through all of these initiatives, Michael remained engaged. He participated in training sessions, observed workshops, and celebrated milestones. His involvement sent a clear message. Inclusion was not just a policy, it was a priority from the top. Employees began to internalize this, and a culture of accountability and empathy began to take root. By the end of the second month, Meridian communications looked different. Not just physically, with accessible facilities and visual alerts, but culturally. Meetings were inclusive. Employees communicated with greater awareness. Visitors, clients, and employees who had previously felt overlooked now felt respected and valued. The lobby, once a place of indifference, had transformed into a welcoming space where every visitor received attention and consideration. One day, as I walked through the lobby, I watched a new client enter. She was a young woman with a hearing impairment, accompanied by an interpreter. The receptionist greeted her warmly, and I noticed employees instinctively adjusting their communication, speaking clearly, making eye contact, and using gestures when needed. The client's face lit up with relief and gratitude. In that moment, I realized the profound impact of our work. It wasn't just policy or training. It was human connection, empathy in action, and a tangible demonstration of respect. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity, planning, and constant adaptation. Every day brought new challenges and opportunities, and I quickly realized that transforming Meridian Communications into a genuinely inclusive workplace would take far more than just policy changes. It required changing hearts, minds, and behaviors, convincing people to see beyond the routines, deadlines, and daily pressures that had defined their professional lives for years. I started to notice subtle, but significant shifts across the company. Employees who once rushed past one another, consumed by their own tasks, now paused to check in, ask questions, and ensure everyone's voice was heard. The creative team, who had initially been skeptical of accessible design initiatives, began sharing ideas openly, experimenting with new techniques, and offering solutions that integrated accessibility seamlessly into their campaigns. One afternoon, I walked past the marketing floor and saw Jenna, a senior copywriter, adjusting her monitor to make text more readable for a visually impaired colleague. She looked up and caught my eye, grinning sheepishly. "I didn't think this would actually make a difference," she admitted. "But it really does. It feels right." That moment struck me harder than I expected. Inclusion wasn't just about following rules. It was about creating an environment where people felt empowered to take small, meaningful actions that improved someone else's experience. Every adjustment, every mindful choice, was a step toward building a culture where everyone felt valued. The success of our initiative soon attracted attention beyond the company. Clients began commenting on Meridian's welcoming environment, noting the visible accessibility improvements and the ease with which all employees communicated, including those with hearing or mobility challenges. During client presentations, the inclusion of captioning, sign language interpreters, and accessible materials created an atmosphere of professionalism and empathy that impressed even the most demanding executives. Internally, I held weekly check-ins with department heads to ensure the momentum continued. These meetings became an essential tool for reinforcing our priorities and addressing concerns. Some managers initially questioned the time spent on inclusion initiatives, arguing that it slowed down productivity or distracted from revenue goals. I listened carefully, validated their concerns, and then demonstrated the tangible benefits: improved employee satisfaction, enhanced client relations, and a stronger company reputation. Over time, even the most skeptical leaders became allies, advocating for accessibility in every decision they made. One of the most rewarding aspects of my role was seeing employees embrace ASL. What began as a small lunchtime class gradually evolved into a company-wide movement. Staff who had initially claimed they had no interest in learning sign language began participating enthusiastically. They practiced signing greetings in the lobby, translating emails for deaf colleagues, and even incorporating ASL into team meetings when appropriate. Margaret, my former supervisor, became one of the most enthusiastic learners, often volunteering to help new students practice their skills. As the weeks passed, the impact extended beyond internal operations. We partnered with local organizations supporting people with disabilities, attending community events, and offering Meridian's resources and expertise. Our marketing campaigns began to incorporate accessibility-focused messaging, highlighting the company's commitment to inclusion. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive. People appreciated that Meridian wasn't just talking about diversity and inclusion, they were living it. Michael Hartwell remained a constant source of support and inspiration. He attended workshops, met with employees, and personally acknowledged progress and achievements. His involvement sent a clear message that inclusion wasn't just my responsibility, it was a core value championed by leadership. Every week, he checked in with me to discuss new initiatives, challenges, and strategies for continuous improvement. Sometimes, we would review plans together, and he would sign thoughtful comments, asking questions and offering insights that demonstrated both his commitment and his growing fluency in ASL. Robert Hartwell, too, remained a central figure in this journey. He visited frequently, participating in workshops, sharing personal stories, and mentoring employees. His presence was not only inspiring but also humanizing, reminding everyone that inclusion was deeply personal, rooted in real experiences and relationships. He often spoke about the challenges he faced as a deaf parent raising a hearing child, helping employees understand the subtle yet profound impact of empathy and understanding in everyday interactions. One day, during a particularly intensive inclusion training session, I asked participants to share moments when they realized the importance of accessibility. The room was silent at first, and then stories began to pour out. Employees recounted times when they had overlooked colleagues, assumed someone couldn't contribute because of a disability, or ignored a visitor who struggled to communicate. Listening to their reflections was humbling. Many admitted that the training had opened their eyes to biases they hadn't been aware of. By the third month, the initiatives had begun to produce measurable results. Employee engagement scores increased significantly, particularly in areas related to inclusivity, satisfaction, and workplace culture. Turnover rates began to decline, as staff reported feeling respected, understood, and valued. Clients praised the seamless accessibility of our presentations and materials, noting that the attention to detail reflected Meridian's commitment to excellence in all areas. It was around this time that an idea emerged, a company-wide recognition program to celebrate efforts in inclusion. We developed a system where employees could nominate colleagues who demonstrated extraordinary commitment to accessibility, empathy, and support. Every month, selected employees were acknowledged during company-wide meetings, receiving certificates and public appreciation. The program was a hit. Employees felt seen, valued, and motivated to continue practicing inclusive behaviors. The recognition reinforced that inclusion wasn't just a policy, it was a shared responsibility, woven into the fabric of everyday work life. Another milestone came when we began redesigning the company's website and client-facing materials. This was an extensive process, involving collaboration with IT, marketing, and creative departments. Every page, every graphic, and every form underwent scrutiny for accessibility compliance. Text was optimized for screen readers, images received detailed alt text descriptions, and videos were captioned or accompanied by transcripts. Navigation was simplified, ensuring that users with varying abilities could access information efficiently and independently. The result was not only more inclusive but also more professional and user-friendly, reflecting Meridian's commitment to both excellence and empathy. Internally, I developed a mentorship program focused on supporting employees with disabilities. Pairing new hires with experienced mentors allowed individuals to navigate the workplace more confidently, understand company culture, and feel supported in their professional growth. Mentors were trained to provide guidance in both technical skills and personal development, emphasizing the importance of communication, inclusion, and advocacy. As these initiatives unfolded, recognition started pouring in from external organizations. Local advocacy groups praised Meridian for its tangible commitment to accessibility. We were invited to speak at conferences, sharing our journey, challenges, and strategies. Other companies began to reach out for advice, curious about how Meridian had successfully integrated inclusion into its culture. The attention was gratifying but also reinforced the responsibility we bore, not just to our employees, but to the broader community. One particularly memorable moment came during a company-wide celebration of our first successful accessibility audit. Employees gathered in the lobby, which had now been transformed into a space that reflected the principles we had been advocating. There were visual alert systems, clear signage, accessible seating, and a calm, welcoming environment. I watched as employees moved through the space, interacting confidently, communicating effectively, and supporting one another. Michael and Robert Hartwell were there, standing side by side. Michael had grown considerably more fluent in ASL, and they signed back and forth, laughing, sharing stories, and connecting in ways that had once seemed impossible. Their relationship was no longer defined by distance or miscommunication. It was active, vibrant, and genuine, a living example of the power of empathy and understanding. During the event, I was called to address the crowd. My heart raced as I spoke, signing and speaking simultaneously. What we've accomplished together is incredible, I began. But this is just the start. Inclusion is a journey, not a destination. Every action, every choice we make impacts someone's experience. Today we celebrate not just policy changes, but a shift in mindset, a culture where everyone belongs, everyone is seen, and everyone matters. The applause was overwhelming. Employees who had once been indifferent now stood, smiling, clapping, and nodding in agreement. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Margaret, standing beside me, signed rapidly, expressing her gratitude and pride. Her transformation from skeptic to advocate was a testament to the power of engagement and education. The recognition didn't stop internally. External media began highlighting Meridian's initiatives. Articles in business journals, interviews on local news stations, and features in professional networks spotlighted our approach to accessibility and inclusion. The company's reputation soared, attracting clients who valued ethical, inclusive practices, as well as talented professionals seeking workplaces that reflected their values. One of the most meaningful recognitions came 6 months after I began my role. Meridian Communications was nominated for a national award for workplace inclusion, competing against some of the largest and most established companies in the country. The nomination alone was a validation of our efforts. The proof that genuine commitment to inclusion could transform an organization, both culturally and operationally. On the day of the award ceremony, Michael asked me to represent Meridian and accept the honor. Standing on the stage, the weight of the journey we had undertaken pressed down on me. I thought about the shy, invisible intern who had first greeted Robert Hartwell in the lobby, uncertain and nervous. I thought about the countless employees, clients, and visitors whose experiences had been impacted by our initiatives. I thought about my little brother Danny, and the joy he would feel knowing that someone had fought for accessibility and inclusion. When I took the microphone, I began speaking with a mixture of humility and pride. This recognition belongs to everyone at Meridian Communications who embraced change, who chose to see inclusion not as a burden, but as an opportunity to make a difference. But most importantly, it belongs to a wise man who taught me the most important lesson: that the most impactful skill we can possess is the ability to see and value the humanity in every person we encounter. In the audience, I saw Robert signing his applause, a smile of pride radiating across his face. Beside him, Michael nodded, his expression reflecting both professional satisfaction and personal growth. The bond between father and son had transformed, and in that transformation, the company itself had evolved. Walking off the stage, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment, but also a recognition that the journey was ongoing. Inclusion, empathy, and accessibility were not boxes to be checked. They were commitments to be lived daily, embedded in every interaction, policy, and decision. I knew there would always be more work to do, more challenges to face, and more opportunities to grow. Yet in that moment, surrounded by colleagues, leaders, and community members, I realized how far we had come. Meridian Communications was no longer just a company. It was a community, a space where everyone could belong, be seen, and thrive. And at the heart of that transformation was a simple act: noticing someone who had been overlooked, taking the time to engage, and choosing to act with empathy. The morning after the award ceremony, I walked into Meridian's glass-paneled lobby and paused at the threshold. The sunlight spilled across the polished floor, illuminating the soft hum of a company in motion. Employees moved through the space with an energy that was different from when I had first stepped into this building months ago. Conversations carried a warmth, a curiosity, and an attentiveness that hadn't existed before. The atmosphere no longer hummed with indifference. It resonated with connection. As I stood there, I remembered the first time I had been in that very spot, awkwardly signing welcome to a stranger I didn't realize was the CEO's father. That small, instinctive act had lit the spark for everything that followed. I thought about how nervous I had been, how invisible I'd felt, and how easily that moment could have been overlooked. Yet somehow it wasn't. Somehow it mattered. That morning, Robert Hartwell was waiting in the lobby, as he often was these days. He had become something of a beloved presence at Meridian. Part mentor, part symbol, part friend. Employees greeted him eagerly, practicing their sign language, sharing updates, and laughing at his dry humor. He turned when he saw me and signed a greeting so fluid it made me smile. "Big day yesterday," he signed, grinning. "Proud of you." I shook my head lightly, replying, "Proud of us. All of us." His expression softened, and for a moment, the bustle of the lobby seemed to fade into the background. He signed slowly, deliberately. "Never thought I'd see this. A company, a son, a culture that speaks my language." His eyes glistened with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Later that day, Michael stopped by my office. He carried the award we had won, a polished plaque etched with bold lettering. He placed it on the shelf behind my desk, then leaned against the doorway with a thoughtful smile. "You know," he said, his voice quiet but certain, "I always thought awards were for clients, revenue, creative campaigns. I never imagined this company would be recognized for something as human. But now that it has, I can't imagine anything more important." I watched him carefully, noticing the subtle shift in his posture, the way he signed words alongside his speech without even realizing it. His hands moved instinctively, an unconscious rhythm that mirrored the integration of accessibility into his life. "It's more than an award," I said softly. "It's a reflection of who we are becoming." He nodded, his eyes distant for a moment. "And I have you to thank for that." I wanted to argue, to insist that it wasn't me, that it was the employees, the culture, the collective effort. But deep down, I knew my role had been to light the path and keep it lit long enough for others to follow. My presence, my insistence, my empathy, it had mattered. And Michael knew it. Over the next few months, Meridian's story spread further. Invitations to speak at universities, industry conferences, and corporate events poured in. I found myself standing on stages I never imagined I'd stand on, addressing audiences I once thought were far beyond my reach. Each time, I shared the same truth: that inclusion begins with noticing, with choosing empathy, with daring to make small changes that ripple outward. At a T1 conference, a young woman approached me afterward. She was an intern, nervous, eyes wide with the same uncertainty I once carried. "Do you really think one person can make that kind of difference?" she asked. I smiled, remembering the lobby, the trembling fingers that had spelled out a simple greeting, the way that moment had shifted the course of everything. "Yes," I told her. "One person noticing can change everything. One act of kindness, one choice to include. It can ignite a chain reaction you can't even imagine." Back at Meridian, the initiatives became self-sustaining. New employees were introduced to accessibility training during onboarding. ASL classes were a permanent fixture, and the recognition program continued to highlight extraordinary efforts. Departments no longer needed reminders. They embedded inclusion into their workflows naturally. Designers asked, "Is this accessible?" before presenting drafts. Managers ensured captions were available during every video meeting. Teams considered multiple perspectives before finalizing strategies. It wasn't policy anymore, it was culture. And within that culture, something extraordinary unfolded. Innovation. Freed from the narrow confines of conventional thinking, employees began generating ideas that were more creative, more empathetic, and more impactful. Campaigns resonated more deeply with clients because they reflected the voices and experiences of a wider audience. The company's growth, both financially and reputationally, soared. One evening, as I was leaving the office, I passed the creative lounge where a group of employees were practicing sign language around a table of pizza boxes. They laughed as they stumbled over signs, correcting one another, cheering when someone finally got it right. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, unseen, watching the scene with a swelling sense of fulfillment, that IT wasn't about me anymore. It was about them, this community, this company, these people who had taken ownership of something bigger than themselves. Michael joined me at the doorway, carrying his coat over his arm. He followed my gaze, then whispered, "You know what I see? A future. One where no one gets left behind." We walked out together into the night, the city lights reflecting off the glass towers around us. For the first time in a long time, I felt not just accomplished, but hopeful. Months later, the final thread of this story revealed itself in the most unexpected way. I received a letter, handwritten, carefully folded, from a woman named Helen. She introduced herself as the mother of a young deaf student who had recently visited Meridian on a school tour. She explained that her daughter had come home beaming, describing how employees greeted her in sign language, how the presentation included captions, how she felt like she belonged somewhere important. Helen wrote, "She told me she wants to work at Meridian one day. Do you know how rare that is? For her to imagine a future in a place that sees her, values her, and speaks her language? You've given my daughter something priceless, hope." I read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the words. Hope. That was the true award, the true legacy. When I showed Robert the letter, he smiled and signed, "That girl is me. Years ago. But now, she won't have to wait 50 years to be understood." And Michael, standing beside him, placed a hand on his father's shoulder and signed back, fluently, without hesitation, "Because we will always speak her language." The circle was complete. A daughter who saw her future, a father who felt heard, a son who learned to listen, and a company that chose to change .as for me. I finally understood something that had eluded me for years. It wasn't about titles or recognition, or even about being the one to make the change. It was about planting seeds of empathy, nurturing them with consistency, and trusting that they would grow into something greater than yourself. The story began with a single greeting, a simple welcome signed in a lobby. It ended with a community that spoke the language of inclusion fluently, not just with their hands but with their hearts. And perhaps that is the lasting echo, that every choice to see, to notice, to include, reverberates far beyond the moment it is made. It shapes futures, heals relationships, and builds legacies that endure. Meridian Communications continued to thrive. But more importantly, it continued to matter. And in the quiet moments, when I watched employees sign across cubicles, when I saw Robert and Michael conversing effortlessly, when I received letters from parents and students, I knew the truth. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning of a world where no one would ever again have to wonder if they belonged. Sometimes, all it takes is one small act of kindness to change not just someone's day, but their entire world, and maybe even your own. So tell me, who in your life deserves to be truly seen today? Comment below, and let's start a ripple of change together.